who's one of our Tau fellows here, who is going to run this panel. Jonathan, I'm sure many people in the room know, is one of the smartest computational journalists in the country. And we've had the pleasure of both having him here as a fellow for the year, and he's been teaching in the dual degree program that the Columbia Journalism School runs in computer science and journalism. It's a program where students get a degree in both computer science and journalism. And Jonathan's really been sort of an innovator in pushing that forward. So Jonathan, do you want to come up and introduce the panel?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks so much. I'm really excited to have a conversation on one of my favorite, nerdiest topics, which is what can we actually do with data? We've got, it was supposed to be 4, but unfortunately Jen Lowe called in sick, but we still have 3 amazing panelists for you this morning, who some of you may know. This is Amanda Cox. She's a graphic editor at the New York Times, has been responsible for some of the most interesting pieces coming out of that publication. I'm hoping that she will tell us a little bit about the process of interpreting data and what happens between a data set and communication with the public. And next we have Dan Gardner, who is a journalist and an author. He's covered all kinds of things from one end of Canada to the other. And his latest book was called Future Babble, which deals all about prediction and why we believe expert predictions and are they any good. And then we have Mark Hansen, our very own Mark Hansen from the Tau Center, who is not only a former statistics professor, but has been involved in a lot of data-driven art, some of which hangs in the lobby of the New York Times. So please welcome our panelists, and we'll get started. In your programs, it says data, what is and isn't it good for? I really wanted the shorter title because then you get to sing it, right? Data, what is it good for? Absolutely, well, something, right? We don't think it's completely useless. We think it's probably good for something, but not everything. And so maybe one of the ways of framing this panel is, how do we decide what it's good for and what it's not for? I want to start with a story. It's a story about gay marriage and the politics of gay marriage. In 2004, Representative Steve Chabot, who is still serving, he's a Republican congressman from Ohio, then as now on the subcommittee of the Constitution in Congress, which I didn't even know existed, asked for a budget breakdown to know what would the effect of legalizing gay marriage in all 50 states be on the US federal budget. So he sent this letter to the Congressional Budget Office. The Congressional Budget Office offered an extensive report. You can see there's 3 different staff contexts for different aspects of this problem. Hugely data-driven effort. They reviewed all, I think it was 1,173 federal laws concerning marriage benefits and taxes and costs, and came to the following conclusion. That essentially there would be a small net positive benefit. Now, when I was doing the research for this story, I discovered a bunch of mentions of this report, which is now 10 years old. None of the mentions were from Representative Steve Chabot. He got the answer, and then, as far as I can tell, he buried it. Now, of course, this is a prediction. This is, in principle, an answer to a question which can be checked. Of course, we haven't seen gay marriage legalized in all 50 states, but we've seen it legalized in many states. And in 2012, 1 year after legalization in New York, the New York State released a press release saying that there was an additional $259 million in business and an additional $16 million in tax revenue. So it turned out to be right, but that's not the story I'm trying to tell here. I'm trying to say data is never just data. It's never just about answering a question. There's a politics attached to it. we got the answer to this question, and then, as you might imagine, various groups used this answer to argue either for or against gay marriage. But does that even make sense? That's the second reason I bring up this story. Can you really use data to decide whether two people of the same sex should be allowed to marry? Is that even a question that you can ask with data? One of the best critiques of the recent wave of data journalism came from Leon Wieseltier at the New Republic. Actually, a lot of parts of it I didn't like, but this part I did like. And he said, a lot of the things that we're talking about are not empirical questions. They're not questions that we can answer by looking at the world in the sort of the data-driven or the positivist or the scientific way. Now that sounds great. Unfortunately, there isn't an easy way to tell which type of question is which, and so that's something that I hope to get into a little bit today. Even when there is something that looks like an empirical question, is unemployment getting better or worse? The same data can mean different things. This is one of my favorite screenshots. Somebody snapped this as a screenshot on their iPad last year. The same number, two different news organizations, and somehow the same number means two different things, depending on whether you're the Times or the Wall Street Journal. How can this be? I thought data was supposed to give us some sort of clear-eyed view of the world, some sort of certainty. But of course, that's not true. Data doesn't speak for itself. Here is, I think, my favorite piece from the Upshot, talking about, again, interpretation of unemployment numbers. And this is, rather than the previous example where the same number meant different things depending on what the author expected, whether they predicted job growth was going to go up or down. Here, all we're doing is we're looking at the statistical error in the numbers. This is something we don't think about a lot, but which is very dear to statisticians' heart, which is what is the uncertainty in the data we look at? We're just beginning to get a sort of public familiarity with the idea of what a margin of error is and what it might mean to have data that looks really official and crisp and standardized, but in fact hides an enormous amount of variation. This is Paul Krugman on the idea of data speaking for itself. He says, if you think the data is speaking for itself, what's actually happening is you have a theory that you're not aware of. So how do we know when we've got the right answer from data? How do we know when our theory about the data is right? This is taking that even further. This is a piece in Quartz from an economist saying even data-backed journalism is opinion journalism. Now we've all seen examples of statistics manipulated to prove a particular point, but she's going even farther. The extreme reading of this idea is that there is no truth, there is only opinion. Journalists tend to be uncomfortable with persuasion. Well, there's an entire field which is dedicated to the idea of using data to persuade. This is a beautiful book, and I recommend every journalist read it. Earlier today, we heard that the job of a journalist isn't just to write stories, it's to communicate. I would go even farther. If you're not trying to persuade, you're probably not doing anything at all. At the very least, the journalist has to try to persuade the audience that what they have discovered is correct. But we don't really think about that, and so as journalists, we're not really well equipped to understand how data interacts with persuasion, how data can be used to persuade, which is why I recommend this book. And we want to persuade. This again is from that piece in the New Republic. This is one of my favorite lines. Persuasion is one of the essential activities of a democracy. When we collect data about the effects of gay marriage to try to convince people either that it should or should not be allowed, we're not trying to establish some fundamental truth about the world. We're not being scientists. We're trying to convince people that what we believe is right. And furthermore, our political system would not work without this type of convincing each other. So now I've started with data is cold hard facts and taken it all the way down to, nah, it's the interpretation depends on the person, depends what you believe, it's a persuasive, it's a rhetoric tool, there's no objective truth. That doesn't seem quite right either. Remember this? Numbers, still the best system for determining which of two things is larger. This was an XKCD comic published shortly after Nate Silver's phenomenal election predictions. Well, that's interesting, right? If you tried to call that election by checking your gut, you got it wrong. If you did statistical analysis, you got it right. There's still something there. It's not completely opinion. This is one of my favorite quotes. It's from a historian, actually. And he was talking about making historical generalizations. Do not guess, try to count. And if you can't count, admit that you're guessing. Of course, hidden in there are complicated words like count. What are you counting? How are you counting it? Are you counting the right thing? Are you asking a question that can even be settled by counting? So here's Nate Silver in one of his most combative moods. It leads to a lot of bullshit, basically. If you're not counting, if you're not using the data, if you don't have some systematic way to talk about the thing that you're talking about, maybe you're just making it all up. And here's the harsh reply. Nate Silver not only wishes to impugn the quality of opinion journalism, he wishes to impugn its legitimacy. So on one side you have, it looks like a group of people who believe that, data is all narrative anyway. It's all subjective. It's used for persuasion. It's all political. On the other side, you have Nate Silver and other folks who are saying, no, wait a minute. If we don't have a systematic way of looking at the world, and to him and other folks, systematic largely means quantitative, then we're just making it all up. This is an old argument. This is qualitative versus quantitative. This is science versus humanities. This is, well, actually, it was nicely summed up in a lecture in 1959 by this gentleman, C.P. Snow. This is a beautiful essay, Two Cultures and the Scientific Revolution. This is an essay about the fact that there was, at that time, two groups of people who called themselves educated intellectuals. There were the traditional humanities scholars. They studied Greek and Latin in school. They had read all of Shakespeare and probably works in several other languages. The continental philosophers, these sorts of people. And then there were the scientists who grew up in a completely different tradition, also centuries old. Newton's laws and all of that sort of thing is now coming up on 400 years. And he said, well, there are these two cultures. And maybe that's the right way to think about this. Maybe this isn't so much a question of philosophy as it is a question of disciplines which are still grappling with how to approach each other. Now, the discussion that we're going to have today is also a very old discussion. This is a form of this conversation that happened in 1954. This is a wonderful little book, still in print today. And this is, again, data versus intuition. This is qualitative versus quantitative. This is statistics versus clinical judgment. Paul Meehl was a psychoanalyst. He was trained in the Freudian tradition, and he became very concerned with the question of, if I have to predict a clinical outcome, how do I do it? So, will this patient respond to some type of treatment? Are they likely to become violent if I release them? Are you going to be happy a year from now? These types of clinical questions. And he said there are basically two ways, right? You can collect a lot of statistics and build a model, or you can do a lot of interviewing and make a judgment based on your experience. And at the time, he reviewed both the theory and all of the evidence. And he found that one was generally superior for this problem. And 50 years later, we now have hundreds and hundreds. I think the most recent review is 800 studies on this question. And most of them point in one direction. We'll get to that, but I'll let you to guess which one turns out to be superior for prediction. But I wanted to steal from the introduction to this book. Here are all of the nice and nasty things that people say about statistical methods and statistical prediction. Right, you've all heard these. Trustworthy, experimental, sound. Or if you don't like it, it's blind, it's oversimplified, it's static, it's sterile. And then the clinical method, which in our case is analogous to a more intuitive, more qualitative, let's say a more opinionated approach to journalism. Well, we don't quite have bullshit in the list of bad words, as Silver used, but we do have sloppy, uncontrolled, muddle-headed, and my favorite, super mundane. I don't think that's widely used anymore. So Neil listed all of these words, all of these polemics that people use for and against the use of quantitative and qualitative methods, data and intuition, the two cultures that C.P. Snow wrote about. And then he said something very smart before he continued to the rest of the book. He said we can move on from that. And so that's what I want to do today. This is not a panel about the argument between these two cultures or these two methods. As tempting as that might be, it might make wonderful television. But we're gonna go past that and try to be a little bit smarter about that. So with that out of the way, I'm to move to our panelists here, and I'm gonna ask them each to answer in a few minutes what sorts of problems in journalism is data good for and not good for? And we'll start with Amanda. You want to go up there? Yeah, either way. Yep.
So I have this theory that we should try to get rid of all of the adjectives, and some of you who are beginning writing teachers would not fight me on that theory. But what that means for a data journalism question is, I think it means that I long for the day that we don't need the data adjective, right? Like, you don't want to be the best young American whatever, you want to be the best whatever. So the few more adjectives that you can trim, the better position that you're going to be in. And I thought of that when Jonathan talked about his, some of the data collected around gay marriage. And I think gay marriage from a data perspective is an interesting topic right now, because it's one of the topics where public opinion has been changing the most rapidly currently, and as journalists we like things that change. Just because there's news embedded in change, it's really easy. And so I think that when you know that gay marriage has been successful, however you define it as successful, it's not crossing a barrier of 50% or 55% because you want to leave yourself a buffer in case you're wrong a little bit. I think it's when you get rid of the adjective, right? Like, so when gay marriage is just marriage, then you know that they're equal, right? And so if data journalism is ever going to pretend to be successful, then it will just be journalism, right? Like, you don't need some quantifying adjective to in some way make it be better. And so then I'm not certain whether the question about what is data good for, whether that gets easier or harder, or in particular, what is data journalism good for? It just becomes the, what is journalism good for? So that's a question that has a lot of history, and so, you know, it takes you places that you couldn't otherwise go. It helps you vote in a more informed way. It comforts the afflicted and afflicts the comfortable, or all of those things. I think nothing is different in the data space if you want to argue like what it's good for. I will acknowledge that there are some things that are slightly, like, you tweak them a little bit with data. So it may scale in different ways. Alex has had many examples this morning that scaled either by geographic context or time. That would change in a different way from other types of information. And historically, or not historically, I came into journalism having been trained a little bit as a statistician, and so I thought, like, maybe you can quantify your uncertainty in a different way. That's what data is good for. You have some sense of uncertainty. I've stepped away from that a little bit in that I think the uncertainty that we quantify is often the least interesting type of uncertainty. The known unknowns are not the fun ones. But at the same time, that's what journalism is. So, like, what is journalism other than, like, triangulating three kind of sketchy guys in an attempt to get closer to the truth, right? Like, and that's no different at all from data. I think, if I may, I want to respond a little bit directly to one of Jonathan's examples, just wasn't something I was planning on doing, but it's a good example anyway. And so Jonathan talked about an unemployment rate, and he showed that screen grab of 2 news organizations responding to a single report in different ways. And this is a graphic we did a few years ago in 2012, right before the 2012 election. It's just an unemployment rate chart. From a visualization standpoint, it's like totally uninteresting. It's a bar chart and a line chart. But then we gave you some goggles. So we said, if you're a Democrat, you can put on your Democrat goggles. And you can say, look, there have been 31 months of job growth. The unemployment rate has fallen 2%, and Friday's drop was larger than expected. And if you're a Republican, you can put on your Republican goggles, and you can say, look, the unemployment rate has been above 8% for 43 months now. And if you wanted to keep up with population growth, you had to add 150,000 jobs a month. And the reason I like this example is that those are all true statements. Like, you don't even have to lie. And like, they're all like, as a perfectly rational, person trying to get to the truth could make all of those statements. And so I think that data really, its strengths, its weaknesses, in the context of journalism, I want to claim, fundamentally are really no different than anything else. So what is it good for? It's good for the same things that journalism is good for and is fed for.
Wow, neatly sidestepped the question there. I like it. No, that was great. Dan.
Okay, I'm too lazy to stand up, so I'll stay here. I should say from the beginning that unlike my esteemed panelists and probably everybody in this audience, I'm not a data scientist or a data journalist. I'm very much from the liberal arts side of the campus. When you hear Monte Carlo, you think statistical modeling. I think, a Mediterranean principality populated by rich douchebags, right? So I'm very much from that half of the culture. And that means, of course, that I'm just woefully inadequate for addressing this topic. So I'll talk about something completely different. Evidence-based medicine. I want to talk about evidence-based medicine. You've all heard the term. What is evidence-based medicine? It's the radical notion that before you give a treatment to patients, you should actually test it to make sure that it works. Believe it or not, that was actually a revolutionary idea in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s. It was implemented. It became a movement that late in the history of medicine. We've been doing medicine for 10,000 years or more. And it was resisted. It was resisted ferociously by eminent doctors because, of course, this meant that the opinion of eminent doctors suddenly became diminished. They couldn't simply say, well, of course it works because I am an eminent doctor and I believe it works. And even today, you still find that kind of resistance to evidence-based medicine. Now, out of evidence-based medicine and its demonstrated success comes evidence-based policy. Go to any public policy department and you'll find that this is an increasingly popular term. There's an interesting debate going on in the academic circles that are interested in this sort of thing. Some people object to the term evidence-based policy, and their argument goes like this. In evidence-based medicine, well, all you're looking at is, does the treatment work? So we should just base the treatment on that one thing. Public policy is more than the empirical question, right? It's not just a question of whether gun control works or not. Does it keep people safer or not? There's also a question of values, competing interests, all those other things that go into democratic decision making. And those are perfectly legitimate and they should be factored into policy. And so they talk about evidence-informed policy. That's what we should talk about, make it evidence-informed policy. Now, I've had this discussion with people who work in this field, and my response to them is, well, of course you're right. You're absolutely right. But have you gone out into the real world? The problem that you face in the crafting of public policy is not that it is too focused on empirical evidence, right? It is quite the opposite. It is, let us ignore the empirical evidence, except when it happens to coincide with our biases, right? It's all ideology, it's politics, it's all those other things that go into the making of the sausage that is public policy. And I hope one day that this objection of yours becomes at all relevant, that we actually have to worry about changing our terminology because we're excessively focused on evidence. Now, why am I blathering on about all this stuff? Because I think these are very useful analogies to what's happening with data journalism now. Data journalism is, in many ways, it's about using new tools, it's about using new data sources to come up with interesting new information. That's true. But like evidence-based medicine and evidence-based policy, it's about raising the epistemic bar, right? How do we know that this is true? You have to ask more. You have to demand better, more and better evidence. To use an extreme example, Peggy Noonan of the Wall Street Journal, shortly before the presidential election of 2012, wrote a column in which she said that Mitt Romney would win. How did she know this? The vibrations were right. That's not good enough, right? And data journalism is about saying, well, no, actually, vibrations, no, we've got to do better than that, right? Now, that, admittedly, of course, that's an extreme example. But there's lots more like it. I woke up this morning, and as I was doing my tour of the newspapers, I was thinking, well, how many examples could I come up with for this talk? And they are just endless, right? Really poor stuff. And so then you have this backlash debate in which you have some of the pieces that you actually referred to. And I remember reading that piece, and aside from the comment about the mullahs of data, or the, what was it, bullying by quantification? Yeah, that was the other phrase. Aside from the occasional phrase like that, that piece by Leon Wieseltier was absolutely correct. But the debate, that backlash debate, is, like the people who object to the use of the term evidence-based policy, really premature. Because it's not that data journalism is crowding out all the other stuff, right? It's merely supplementing and enriching at this point. I hope someday we should have to have the discussion where we say, hey, hang on, we're paying too much attention to the data, right? And let's talk about these other things like values and so on. I hope one day.
Thank you. Mark?
Thank you, and thank you for letting me address you all this morning. I don't know that I could say much more beyond what Amanda said as usual. She's concise and right on point. I would like to see a day when data journalism was just journalism, or we didn't have that adjective attached to it. And I often teach my students an unfortunate amount of history around data and data analysis. That's probably a failing of mine. But Tukey, John Tukey, literally the guy who wrote the book on exploratory data analysis, used to anthropomorphize data and anthropomorphize it as having a voice. So he said that the clever data analyst really only need listen to what his data have to tell him, in the sense that it was a kind of interview, that you would ask the data questions, or that it would give you what you needed, like an interview. And while I completely agree with Amanda, I think I can maybe underscore her point and take it a little farther. One of the things I teach, again, my students, is that all data, after all, are human. And without human effort, ingenuity, memory, we don't have data. And remembering that human systems, that data are human systems helps us answer that question about what it's good for. Data, code, and algorithms shape how we interact, they shape how our cities function and our societies operate, they shape systems of power around us, and journalists should be able to interrogate, to tell stories from that data. So I could get really geeky and talk about what data are good for, and maybe sort of formalize sort of axes along which you could place different types of data. So first of all, how actionable is it? Is it like a printed bus schedule that you can do not much with except unfold and look at when the bus arrives? Or is it an interchangeable, like an API that publishes the precise location of a bus, every bus in the city at any moment, and you can use that to build something new from? Or for government data, you could have an axis that describes, is it about service delivery, like a bus schedule, or is it about data for accountability, like election finance data? So you could, if you wanted to or pushed, you could maybe start to put a structure around where data come from and sort of its journalistic purposes. And then, of course, as journalists, we're often interested in secondary uses of data. So stories may come from clever views of a data set that was collected for an entirely different purpose. But these are all very instrumental views of data. I also try to get my students to think beyond the purely instrumental and think of data as a source of speculation and experimentation. We can think of data as a source of answers, and perhaps when we teach people about A/B testing or randomization like we heard about this morning, we think of it as providing some kind of an answer to a question. But instead, data can be just as useful as helping us arrive at the right question. Data, code, and algorithms are probes, and sometimes the only question we come to a data set is what's here, and we're looking for the right question. In short, data can be a partner in a creative practice, and the process of figuring out what to measure, how to model, how to express something, these are all opportunities to figure out a group's values, to figure out sort of what you stand for. I remember interviewing Paula Antonelli, who's a curator, design curator at Museum of Modern Art, about their use of data. And if you think there's sort of data is affecting journalistic practice, data is also affecting curatorial practice. So there are models that tell them how many people they will have on any given Wednesday, how many people they'll lose because of the Puerto Rican Day parade, how the characteristic of this kind of artist will lead to this many people in the galleries. People will spend this much time in front of the different paintings. And I asked her, with all of that information, does that affect your curatorial practice? How does that result? What does that? Isn't it tempting, right? I think the MoMA equivalent of cat pictures would be all Monet all the time, right? So she's like, no, the data actually, it's a moment where you're forced back onto the values and ethics of your organization. You're forced to think about those things in a way. So again, bringing the human side of data and its implications. Because as you heard this morning, transforming the world into bits, that is that first step that goes from phenomena in the world, whether it's a person reading your content to something related to the climate. That first step is a difficult one, and it's a hard one for statisticians, and one that we're often quiet about. My training is in statistics. That's where my doctorate sits. And aside from experimental design or survey sampling, we don't talk very much about what it means to turn the world into data and the implications of that very first step. So I would also say, and I just have two more points and then I'll shut up, that we have to be a little careful about questions about what data are good for, because those questions are also wrapped up in similar discussions about the tools we use, the models we apply, and the representations we use when we structure data. That all of these things frame the kinds of answers we can come up with, the kinds of questions that we can ask. What we think of as data is limited by the tool sets that we have around us. There's a beautiful quote by Flaubert about the stronger the telescopes, the more the stars. I think that it might be time for journalists to start taking some authority over the metaphors and abstractions and tools that we use to look at data. It's time to think about stories that don't fit comfortably into the set of tools that we've been given. We hit what's often called a tool horizon, where our ideas or our observations or the stories we want to write can't be expressed in a particular tool set. So to say what is data good for is an open question, but one that's bound in tools and fundamental questions that we as a profession need to be engaged in creating.
Thank you. That was a very expansive
Sorry.
view. No, that's great.
I've had half a bagel now, so
I had a whole bagel.
I'm not used to the carbs.
No, this is a great start. So it strikes me that all of you gave a thoroughly human perspective on data, which is great, because ultimately this is a human endeavor. It's sort of easy listening to you talk to think about, well, this aligns very neatly with all of the humanities discourses about, narratives and relativism and the social construction of knowledge and all these things. Beautiful stuff, except I think many people have the feeling that, or the hope, that data can show us some sort of truth that's not otherwise available. Anyone want to take a swing at that one?
Given today's top stories about, the VA hospital systems and whether certain hospitals are cheating the measure, I think my answer to that is when you measure something, you start to change it. So whether you measure how long it takes to get an appointment at a VA hospital, then maybe there are incentives for someone to make that look like it's smaller than it is. Or when you start to care about slugging in baseball, maybe you accidentally cause the amount of strikeouts to go up because people are encouraged to swing for the fences a little bit more than they used to when you only cared about batting average. So I feel like the idea of data as truth needs to be minded by the idea that when you measure it, you also start to change it. Like, even if it was truthful before you started counting, well, as soon as you start counting, you touch it in some way.
And that's a point somehow that doesn't get taught. I don't know where those lessons get taught. Maybe it's the sort of science and technology studies or something like that. But I know that even in introductory statistics classes, when we teach about things like p-values and confidence intervals, and we very rarely teach about, well, although again, I torture my students with this, about what it means to have a 0.05 cutoff put in place, because suddenly people are incentivized to be on one side of a line or another. So the methodology that you invoke, the ways in which you count, all of these things create an incentive system that changes as Amanda was saying, the system that you're supposed to be passively and objectively observing.
And yet, polls are better than lawn signs and vibrations for calling elections. So there's something there still, right?
I mean, maybe not anymore, right?
Maybe
like
not
that's the
anymore?
question, right? I think the rise of the popularity of models, I think we will see this cycle encourages people. I believe we will see people encouraged to release polls more than in the past that are sketchy in some way. That's due in part to just the climate. It's gotten harder to conduct a poll just because people don't answer their telephones anymore, and there are fewer news organizations who can pay for a poll and whatever, right? But I don't know that will always be true, right? Like that may have been true once, but I don't know that will always be true. Or you have to start to get more clever about it, right? So you stop asking people polls about what they think, and you start asking them polls about what their friends think. And so I think it's a constant like cat and mouse game of innovation about where.
Yeah. And it's not that polling, I mean, I suppose now we think of this as old school, but Gallup's first polls really did a number on the American population, right? There were lots of people saying, look, nobody talked to me about this. What do you mean 50% of Americans believe? Like, nobody talked to me, none of my friends around me believe this. Where did this come from, right? There was, I think at this point, people maybe understand what that's all about, but at the time, it really did change. What Gallup was doing when Gallup created his first polls was also creating the notion of kind of mass opinion. Like that notion didn't exist before. So there was, back in its origin point, a change that happened.
Huh. That's interesting. I like that. Nobody talks to me. It sort of belies the fact that a lot of people, sort of the population in general, we're going into increasingly sophisticated models and techniques, and if we can't explain how we got the conclusions we got, maybe nobody's going to believe us, right? I'm going to throw this to Dan and ask you to talk a little bit about the things that you've been researching and writing about for a number of years now.
Sure. That's an open-ended invitation, isn't it?
Pretty much.
Well, I think what's most relevant and what might be most interesting to folks here is that I'm co-writing a book tentatively to be called Super Forecasters with Philip Tetlock, who many of you know well is a psychologist at Wharton. Phil is currently engaged in an enormous research program on forecasting. And what he's doing in conjunction with an intelligence agency is he has an enormous number of volunteers. It varies from year to year, but it's something like 2,500, 3,000 volunteers. And they are trying to predict the sorts of things that intelligence analysts try to predict, which is, will Greece default? Will the Russians take Crimea? That sort of thing. These are really, really hard questions. You had mentioned at the beginning Paul Meehl. Paul Meehl is absolutely correct. When you have a statistically validated tool for prediction, use the statistically validated tool. Oh, sorry, did I preempt your?
No, I didn't
wasn't
actually
it?
say.
Sorry.
I was hoping that you would talk. So let's do a little. Oh, well, I think you just gave away the answer here.
Sorry. Sorry.
But I'm wondering what people's intuitions before that comment is. You know, if I'm a clinical psychologist and I have to predict whether somebody is going to do something violent in the next year if I release them from the institution, let's just say show of hands. How many people would think that that's better based on clinical judgment? All right, so we're looking at maybe 10, 15%, something like that? All right, and so the rest of you presumably think that data is going to be better at that forecast? Yeah, not 90%. So okay, not everybody voted. But in fact, that's true, right?
Yeah, I really apologize for destroying that punchline.
No, that's all right.
Yeah, no, that is the case. When you have a statistically validated tool, you stick with the tool. Clinical judgment does not matter how eminent the expert is. Do not take subjective judgment when you have this validated tool. However, the problem with life is that we encounter a vast number of problems for which we do not have these tools, and which we probably never will have these tools, such as will Russia take Crimea? You do not have a tool for that. And so what Phil is doing is he's working with these volunteers and he's having them make subjective probability judgments. They are saying, how likely do I think it is that Russia will take Crimea? 60%, you know? It's very, very subjective. But what's really remarkable about what's happening is that he's getting amazing results. The top forecasters among this group are amazingly accurate. They are actually beating prediction markets composed of, can I say this officially? This has never been officially acknowledged. I read it in a newspaper once. They are beating an internal prediction market within the intelligence community consisting of intelligence analysts who have access to classified information. These are volunteers. One of them, one of my favorites, is he's a retired pipe layer in Nebraska. Yeah, and he's kicking the CIA's ass. So really, really interesting, fun stuff, and I hope you buy my book. Thank you.
Can you expand a little bit on Tetlock's earlier work, the expert political judgments? Because I'm not sure if everyone's here is familiar with that.
Yeah, you've probably heard the punchline, which has been repeated everywhere. Phil did something really remarkable in the mid to late 1980s. He did the world's biggest experiment on the accuracy of expert predictions. He got some 280 experts to make a vast number of predictions over a large number of time frames, and he waited, and in 2005, he published the final results. I mean, this is literally how long this experiment took. And the punchline, which is repeated everywhere from this research, is that the average expert was about as accurate as a dart-throwing chimpanzee, bump, right? Because all the cynics like that, and unfortunately, a lot of people take away from that prediction, forecasting is a fool's errand. We can't predict, the future is unpredictable, give up now. That's not what the research concluded. What he actually found was there were two statistically distinguishable groups of experts. One, they were a travesty. The other actually had modest but real predictive insight. And if you want to know how to distinguish between the two, the people who are a travesty, the people you should run away from, they're the people who dominate the media.
So let me sort of get this straight. So you're saying that in the prediction game, this is the will Russia invade Crimea, who's going to win the election, all that sort of thing. Generally, media figures do badly.
Generally, to flesh it out with my wiseacre response, basically what Phil found was there was an inverse correlation between fame and accuracy. The more famous the expert was, the less accurate he was, right? And if you look at the profile of the sort of expert who was an absolute disaster at forecasting, they have one analytical model. They use that analytical model over and over in different domains. They insist on pushing their analysis until they come to a conclusion, and because, of course, they push to a conclusion, they are very confident that conclusion is correct. So what have I just described? I've just described about 95% of the talking heads on television, haven't I, right? And these people are a disaster. And this is one of the big problems, is that, in fact, the media too often turn for analysis to the people who provide what we psychologically crave. We haven't discussed psychology here, but it's a critical piece of this puzzle. We psychologically crave certainty. When you go to an expert and the expert says, I think there's 6 factors involved, maybe 7 on the one hand, on the other hand, it doesn't feel like an answer, right? You remember Harry Truman said, I want to hear from a one-armed economist because I'm sick of hearing on the one hand and the other hand. That's human nature, right? And unfortunately, the media follow human nature, and so we consult those that we probably should not be consulting so much.
So now we're talking about prediction, which maybe is the clearest example that I've been able to find of where data is a clear win, right? Anytime you look at this stuff, whether it's clinical psychology or Tetlock's work, we see that some sort of systematic way wins. as long as you have more than one system, apparently, right? You can't always, follow the same thing. So let's talk about predictions in journalism briefly. Obviously, there's election predictions. What other kinds of predictions are there? Because I think there's actually more than are generally realized. Amanda or Mark, do you want to take a stab at this? I realize that was a bit leading.
Most prolific is probably TV weather, right?
Sure.
Like if you think of weather as journalism, and weather drives a lot of audience to journalism, or historically has. So I think that's maybe the most prolific. I think you see it a lot in, I think the interesting prediction, I think predictions are all over all of our lives every day. So if you're working as a journalist, it's who is the person who is most likely to pick up the phone when I call them and say something interesting, right? Like that sort of prediction. It's not a formalized model, but I think that prediction drives all of our lives.
I guess I would, so obviously, maybe just on the subject of prediction, things are getting a lot more complicated in terms of data journalists feeling more empowered to take on stronger and stronger models, or to try more and more things. And I think that brings up, in a way, a transparency issue around those predictions or around the models that are being used. You quoted the two cultures. Leo Bryman had cited another pair of cultures around modeling. One that treats predictions like a black box, sort of data go in, these are the conditions, and what comes out is a prediction. And then the other culture says, sorry, yeah.
Sure.
So one culture is simply a black box, data go in, the substance of a prediction would go in, the things that go into making that prediction go in, and out comes the prediction. The other culture is more about peering into that box and learning something of the structure of what went into that prediction, what are the important variables, how do they relate to one another. There's a lot of, if you will, narrative possibilities inside an open box model that I know Amanda has used to great effect in some graphics in the Times and so on. So I think that as sort of data journalists move from tabulating to mapping to to making predictions or making sort of model-based descriptions of what's present, there are interesting new sort of narrative implications for that.
I also think a lot about generalization, right? If you interview 5 students about student debt, and they tell you about their hardships, and you write that article, there is an implicit claim in there that these 5 students represent all students, perhaps. So journalism actually, I think, does quite a lot of generalization without really looking at it too closely. You're nodding, I notice you're not. It's interesting, because you work in news and you don't. Either of you want to take that up?
Oh, I just think the placing of the blame is slightly misguided. If you, as a reader, think an article about 5 interesting students who may have totally interesting experiences and extrapolate that to all people, I don't think I would blame the author of that article for that extrapolation.
Could we have suggested that maybe they should have included the data on student debt if it were available?
It depends what kind of story you want to write. I think there are thousands of interesting stories that are stories just about one quirky individual, right? Like that, it doesn't need to extrapolate. Like it depends, like whether you are trying to attempt to write a story that conveys something about an aggregate or an average. Sure, absolutely. Like, is it irresponsible to talk to 3 people about their personal experiences if you're trying to change policy for an average student? Yes. Like if you're trying to share the interesting experience of one person who is struggling with student debt, like who cares who cares if it extrapolates?
But the problem, I think, is that very often I don't think journalists take into account human nature. We extrapolate from experience. So if you have Uncle Fred who gave up smoking by some odd method, drinking pickle juice or whatever, people will conclude that how do you quit smoking? You drink pickle juice because Uncle Fred, it worked for him. That is absolutely normal human thinking. This is what we do. We extrapolate from experience. And so when we present anecdotes that are interesting and colorful and memorable, what do? We invite people to extrapolate that somehow these are meaningful insights into a larger problem. And we do that extrapolation all the time, which is why either you have to be very explicit and careful about what you're actually presenting, or you should look at the data and find the statistically representative example. I'll give you an example from a Canadian newspaper. The Globe and Mail did an enormous series on cancer. And they sent a reporter out and they said, we want to do profiles of every individual in Canada who dies of cancer on a particular day. Well, that's interesting. That's powerful stuff, right? And statistically representative, absolutely. So she went out and she did an enormous amount of work, and she came back and she said, I have a problem. They're all really old. Overwhelmingly, like virtually every single person, if you look at the people who die from cancer, they'll be overwhelmingly old. And that's just not, those aren't great stories, right? It's one extremely old person after another who lived a long life and then died of cancer. And the editors said, oh, well, those aren't good stories. And guess what they did? They went out and they did profiles that was mainly skewed toward young people, and the face of the entire series, and believe me, it was a gripping story, was a 3-year-old who died of cancer, which is wildly unrepresentative. And as a result, what did they do? They implicitly told the population a falsehood about the nature of cancer.
So that's very interesting, and I've been involved in such stories myself from both sides. So, which makes me ask the question, should journalism be representative? Should we be seeking to represent the experiences of a whole population, all students, as opposed to just those 3? And if so, representing who, and how would we even do that?
I mean, I think the cancer example is a great example of you pick your profile in some structured way, right? Like there, I think is one way to the how. I think if every project you did was done in some structured way, it would lead to a newspaper that was just pretty dull in some ways, or not compelling in the way that it would actually cause you to care about anything. I think.
I think also that maybe those sorts of interviews, the example you brought up about sort of juice or whatever as a cure for cancer, that there is something to be said about a kind of pre-data moment where you're trying to unlock what knowledge there might be in a community about a particular situation or a particular thing affecting them. And going through an interview process, maybe something that's more ethnographic or qualitative by nature, to figure out before you even start doing the broad data collection, which already assumes you know what variables to measure and how that condition needs to be translated into data and then analyzed, and the whole machine kicks in. Prior to cranking up the machine, you have to, there's a spark, a source of something there first, and if the journalistic organization is charged with collecting the data and not just analyzing data as it exists, then some of that asking questions and figuring out, unlocking some of the knowledge in the community before you grind it under the statistical machine is probably worth taking the time to do.
Mark, I'm so glad you mentioned ethnography, because one of the ways in which this divide plays out is, ethnographers versus data scientists. And it feels really pointless to me at this point. I think it's easy to see that there are certain types of insights that you can only get from ethnography and vice versa. I think my favorite take on this was actually something that Chris Anderson pointed me to. He's here somewhere. It was an ethnography and big data conference at UC Santa Barbara a couple months ago, and in the abstract to that they said, well, traditionally people have said ethnography and data are on two sides of some line, But actually, we think they're both on the same side of a line. It's the line that separates engaging with the world out there from theoretical work or lab studies. And I thought that was a useful perspective. The commonality there is they both involve going out and looking at the world.
Yeah, absolutely. This hits on something that's of particular interest to me. And an example from my own work, I did a lot of work on criminal justice. Very often you will see people who will say, for example, I support a strong mandatory minimum sentence for this crime because I believe it will make people safe. It will reduce crime. And then somebody like me comes along and goes to the criminology department and does a lot of work and produces all the research and says, actually, no, it's not a very cost-effective means of doing that. You really don't want to do that. And I can tell you what the response is. Almost invariably, the response is, yeah, well, I still support it because I believe it's just. What's really happening in that dialogue is that the empirical claim, this will reduce crime, this will keep us safe, isn't what's really driving the view. What's really driving the view is a different claim. Very often it's a moral claim. You mentioned gay marriage. Are they really going to change their position if they are told that there's some empirical evidence that for or against whether gay couples are effective parents, or whether, the cost to the legislature or whatever? Those empirical questions aren't driving the discussion. But very often, that work where you talk about going out into the field and really talking to people, that's where you surface what's really the subterranean question. And very often, what I found, I'm not sure that this is necessarily as true in the United States as it is so much elsewhere, but very often, people in a modern context are uncomfortable, particularly with moral language, right? You don't make moral claims in the public sphere. So if you, for example, think that marijuana should remain illegal because you think it's immoral, it's just wrong, right? You don't say that. You don't put it that way. No, you say, well, no, if you legalize it, it will increase addiction and it will lead to more crime. You make an empirical claim, but that empirical claim is really just covering up a moral claim underneath. And as you say, it's the ethnographer who goes out and has that discussion who's going to get at that discussion underneath, which is a very rich way of doing journalism.
So unsurprisingly, we're coming around to the view that good journalism has to have both a data and a non-data component, which I think goes back to your wish, Amanda, which is that we stop calling it data journalism and it just becomes journalism.
It's not special.
It's not special. Oh, you're hurting my feelings. Okay, so I'm going to ask one last question, and then we will open it up to questions for everyone else. If the same data can be interpreted in different ways, where does that leave the concepts of truth and accuracy? What do we do? Is it all subjective? Are there standards for interpreting data?
This is the kind of thing I think Mark would do.
Yeah.
It's like
So not fair. Look, this isn't something that's unique to journalism. Back in graduate school, I had a consulting job, which was probably one of the few consulting jobs I've ever done, and it was on the adjustment of the 1990 census. So now you know how freakishly old I am. So it was about whether or not it was a suit that was brought against the a number of big cities sued the federal government to adjust the U.S. Census because there was known undercount of minorities in big cities. And since federal money is tied to the census, getting those numbers wrong is really important. It's a real policy problem. So as a third-year graduate student, I found myself helping one of the faculty members. I did my degree at Berkeley. Two of them actually, with their testimony, doing simulations, running simulations, simulating censuses, simulating. The shtick here was that someone had put forward an adjustment process. Actually, John Tukey put forward an adjustment process, and Steve Feinberg at Carnegie Mellon. And so these are enormous figures in my field, and I was very small and will ever be small in comparison to these great thinkers. So they had put something forward, And the people I was working with, the faculty members at Berkeley, had pulled together a series of tests and simulations to try to show that why this wasn't right. And here we had the two giants of, two sets of giants in my field who were at complete odds about whether or not this worked. They came up with sort of completely different views on whether or not the census should be adjusted, and whether or not this particular procedure did anything but just move noise around. And I didn't fully understand the stakes of my profession until that moment, and also the complexities of drawing inferences and making sense of the world around you using math and computation as a tool to feel that world, that it's extremely complicated. And we try to cover it over and give it a smooth veneer. Like if you open up textbooks, how many of you have had an introductory statistics class? Right. How many of you enjoyed it, by the way? But I mean, an introductory textbook these days, if you follow it, the structure of it, the narrative it leads you through, is effectively the narrative one would follow if one had to prove the t-test, like why it worked, right? So there's a little thing about the central limit theorem, there's a little thing about estimators and so on. And actually, while on that table of contents, if you compare the table of contents of just about any modern textbook to Fisher's original book for research workers, you'll find that those two table of contents are largely the same. His book, however, being written in the 20s, current textbooks, and you'd hope that the state of data had changed somehow in the intervening years. But my point is that we treat it with a kind of veneer, like that it's not hard, that there's a formula, and if you put the thing in the formula, it'll tell you the answer and there's truth. What it doesn't tell you is about the intense arguments that Fisher and Neyman and Pearson went through to describe what it meant to learn from data, whether it's taking a subjectivist view of probability or a frequentist view of probability. It's a hard problem to learn from data and to read the signals in nature and to take those and tell a story from them. And it's a story that goes back maybe to 1660 with the beginning of probability, right? So it's an old and it's a hard question, and it's one that I think we as statisticians have tried to make look simple, but in fact it's a really difficult one, and about which there's still a lot of debate and a lot of ongoing sort of angst. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and unfortunately too well.
Okay.
So I'll ask my final follow-up then. But I mean, if we want to improve the quality of data journalism, or now just journalism as we're calling it, we saw an upside-down chart this morning, right? Like surely there's got to be some sort of best practices or standards or things that we can say are wrong. Those things exist, right?
Yeah, well, look at the way science actually works, right? Because this is fundamentally, this is the great question of science, right? How do you get truth? The way science actually works isn't that someone shouts eureka and they have truth and it's chiseled into a granite monument, right? What it is someone makes a claim, someone else counters that claim, and then they argue about it furiously, and it goes on for years and decades until a generation of scientists dies and everyone agrees that this is true. That's the way science works. It's horrible and ugly and messy, and it takes a long time. But that's exactly the way it played out there, right? Because you had all sorts of people who said, wait, that doesn't make any sense, and there was catcalls and food thrown and so on, and rightly so, because it was pretty outrageous. But what's interesting is, because of the tools of data journalism, because this is all happening online, it's happening at a level of collaboration. The possibilities of collaboration, the possibilities of exactly that sort of pure critique, which is fundamental to basic science, which in the 18th century and the 19th century and the 20th century took forever because they were all sending their little missives by passenger pigeon or whatever. These things can happen at lightning speed now. But that's the critical thing, is to understand that it's not one scientist who is authoritative and has the truth. It is scientists after arguing for a great long time. Hence, it's not one data journalist who will be authoritative and find the truth. It is that great collective argument that eventually thrashes out the truth.
I agree. I mean, I think one thing in the science program here we teach about that process of science, the messy human process, the arming up, that it's more like a knife fight than anything else, right? And I do want to be a little cautionary here, but in a different way. I mean, I think that there's, so again, to go back to I didn't realize I'd be reflecting so much on graduate school, but at some point I spent an entire semester in my applied statistics class with a stack of readings that was about this big. And it was 2 or 3 articles from every possible journal, from every possible field you could imagine. And we spent the next 15 weeks slowly tearing each and every one of them apart. Why it was wrong, why what they were doing was incorrect, why they couldn't draw the conclusions they were, and it left me completely paralyzed for a year. I couldn't make a single thing without that critical voice coming in. And I want to be a little careful about the criticalness here. And I didn't want to mention this, but I had gotten invited a couple weeks ago to take part or to address. We're about to have the joint statistical meetings in August. How many of you have been to a joint statistical meeting? Ah, come on! It's like 4,000 statisticians in one place, right? All the major statistical organizations get together. It's a raucous time, right? Especially because up until a couple years ago, the first night used to end with a party and a dance. And I tell you, there was nothing more exciting than the dance at the joint statistical meeting. Anyway, so I got invited to give a talk to the heads of these major statistical organizations, like the Royal Statistical Society, the American Statistical Association, people, again, that I don't know that I have a lot. Anyway, so, and they had given me a topic. Having looked at my background, having looked at where I am, they gave me a topic. And the topic was, is data journalism an oxymoron? Why reporters get it wrong and how to set it right. And I wrote back to them that I found this deeply offensive. Like, first of all, they didn't do their homework and they don't know where I'm teaching. But secondly, that I sincerely believe that statisticians and many of the sort of quantitative fields, the data science, the computing science fields, have quite a lot to learn from journalists. In fact, I wrote back, I said to the poor guy who wasn't expecting my response, I said, I'm happy to do this, but I find the topic offensive. I'm in a school of journalism now, and I think we as statisticians have a lot more to learn from journalists than they have to learn from us. Sure, there's some basic training in statistical literacy that J schools could do a better job at, but journalists can teach statisticians about telling compelling stories with data, about finding socially important stories in data, and about wrenching statistics from the soul-sucking grasp of mathematics. So I'm happy to participate. I'm happy to participate in your discussion, but not unless we reframe it. But I think that there's a real mistake to think I think there's a mistake in overemphasizing where we get it wrong. Yes, we need to set best practices. Yes, we need to take control over the metaphors and the abstractions that we are using day to day. We should be tool builders and not tool users. As journalists, we have ethics and values that our tools and the things that we need to do that are unique, right? And I think that it can be a kind of trap to spend too much time fixating on places where we get it wrong. I would really like to see places where we get it right heralded, because I think that that's the way that we can start to push things forward.
Thank you. That was wonderful, especially the what was it? The dead grasp of mathematics. Soul-sucking. Thank you. Adjectives. All right. So we've got a little bit of time for questions. So please, yeah, stepping up to the mic. Is that how we're doing it? Awesome.
Hi. That was great. But I do want to play devil's advocate for a minute against what I see as a reasonable consensus, which is that adjectives should be gotten rid of. First of all, that would mean that conferences like this are a bad idea and we should stop having them. Two, saying that it's just journalism and that's it would sort of be like Michel Foucault ending madness and civilization by saying, well, you know, if we do it right, it's all just good mental health care. So to make this a question...
That should have gotten a better laugh than that. That should have been...
You got it. So why do you all feel the need, this is the question, why do you all feel the need to do that? Why not do what a social scientist would do, which is to embrace the difference and say this is something new and unique and no one has ever done it before? Why do you want to say it's all just good journalism?
one of us should
I
go.
I will claim that I think journalism as an entity has a longer tradition of great work. So if you want to attach yourself to great work and encourage yourself to think that the positive examples and the best possible examples are what I am aspiring to do, the fewer adjectives, the better.
I think also you could look, journalism is not unique in the sense that it's having a number done on it by data. So if you look at the humanities through the digital humanities, if you look at geography, if you look at architecture, if you look at design, each of these fields, every single field on campus is having a moment where the effects of measurement, quantification are having an effect, and they are fundamentally having to change what they teach and how they teach it. And you can track each of these disciplines, like architecture, when forms stopped being found through drawing and started being found through the computer, right? There's a tick that happens. There's a tick that happened in geography with the introduction of GIS. There's a tick that happened in design with the introduction of a language called processing. There's a tick that happened in typography. There are these tick moments that happen, and they're happening across campus. The digital humanities are happening now, where they're wrestling with what it means to have the core artifacts of their practice turned into something that's open to a kind of data investigation. On the other side of that, it will be what you find is that there isn't sort of computational architecture. It's architecture, right? They have absorbed the tools, they have absorbed the techniques, and it becomes one and the same. It's not to say that there aren't unique characteristics, but I think we are experiencing a tick moment, a moment where we'll tip over, and more of our people will be sort of better able to do these things, and then it will be part of the ethos of the discipline. But that's spoken from a statistician standpoint. I'm not a journalist by training, so you can ignore all of that.
You are a J-School professor, I hasten
Well,
to
all
point
right,
out.
but it doesn't say that. It says the Brown Institute here.
Oh,
so
well,
that's-
hey.
Well, I mentioned this through Twitter a few minutes ago, but as a follow-on to the question of should journalism be representative or should it be focused on certain groups, the issue fundamentally becomes, is it even feasible to be truly representative, to have actually truly representative sample? And even if you get to that point, if you can't have anything truly representative, couldn't you still get some viable data? For instance, there's a refrain over Internet Week that even, you're maybe familiar with the photo of all the Foursquare check-ins around Manhattan and such. And then the presenter asked how many use Foursquare, and 5 hands raised, about 100. Says it's a representative sample. Well, no, but you could still get plenty of insights from whatever data is there, or even how matter abundant it is. So what's your view on it? Is it even feasible, and would even be something that we should ultimately desire to make it truly representative?
So I think your question in short form is it
Is it
even
feasible and-
possible
yeah, true,
to do
yeah.
representative journalism? And can we learn from non-representative
Yes.
journalism? Is that right?
Yes.
All right. Well, we've got 2 statisticians on the panel here. Do you want to try this one, Amanda?
I mean, yeah, sure, it's close. I mean, is it ever possible to be true representative? That's like as a field day of groups that are hard to sample and, you know, all kinds of like issues, like close to truly representative, sure. But I think I would argue that I enjoy my journalism being biased toward interestingness, right? Like I am willing to accept that trade-off of bias toward interestingness. And maybe that, so, you know, can we get closer to representative I think for some stories, like, sure. Is it always desirable? I don't think the answer is yes to always desirable.
But I think the key thing is when representativeness is not possible, it must be flagged. And the problem is it's very often not. Again, an example from personal experience. I've worked in Russia. If you find a Russian on the street who can speak English, you have found a very unrepresentative Russian. And yet, what do you see foreign reporters do when there's a story in Russia? Well, man in the street interview, and somebody with a thick Russian accent is talking to you in English. But they don't flag and say, by the way, the very fact that this person is speaking English probably tells you that they're really, really different than the average Russian in the street. I just wish we would flag that sort of thing.
Part of the problem of flagging, I mean, so part of the problem of flagging is that if you have a really badly designed set of data, it may be really, really hard to say where the deficiencies are, right? So just to say, well, this isn't representative doesn't really get you off the hook, because it's right. So I think, but I think also that data journalism, part of its, at least in the classes that I've taught so far, many of the data sets that the students bring in, there aren't really questions of representativeness or what have you, because they're bringing in a complete set of something, right? So here's everything that we know about this thing, right? And it's all the users of this, or all the particular things that happened here. And so in some sense, they can make even stronger, like they want to attach some statistical significance or something. I said, you don't need that. You're done with it, right? There is no randomness here. We can't, I mean, unless you're a subjectivist, there's a limit to like how you have to work really hard to put a probabilistic framework on this, and so you're done. It's a gold star, right? So anyway.
Thank you.
So I wanted to go back to something earlier about this point on maybe empiricism, the use of data to say that something is true or not. I live and work in DC, and a lot of people say things that aren't true there.
It's a bold statement.
And they'll often be using the same data. You always go back to Daniel Patrick Moynihan. Right? Well, people don't have the same facts anymore. All you have to do is look at the debate around climate change. Is it anthropogenic or not? Administration's taking a huge bet right now by releasing a ton of data online, Climate Data Initiative, saying use this stuff, do projections. State and local governments are saying, thank you, we'll use that to try to figure out what's going to happen so that we can pre-position and change things. So interesting policies like Harvard saying, you know what, we think we're going to get hotter, so we're going to equip our new dorm rooms with ACs. So the question I have is maybe a tougher one in a journalism school, but is this stuff, the use of data and going after the scientific method with it, going to enable more news organizations to call bullshit on politicians lying? I'm really interested in this because I see this pop up a lot in the policy discussions in DC. We had this project going up. So hope President Obama uses this so that instead of listening to X person saying my gut tells me, they'll say yes, but the data shows this. Is that going to happen? What are the barriers to it? What are the challenges here? Because it seems like as a society, as a world, we're putting a lot of faith in this group of people doing better with the data to tell us what's true or not. But there's some cultural issues around saying the he said, she said thing is something we can leave behind.
Wow, okay, so are journalists going to be able to use data to call bullshit on politicians? That's a good one.
Do you know, I'm going to use the worst possible form of evidence to answer that question. Personal perception. I've been a journalist since 1997, and I've spent a lot of that time calling bullshit on politicians, sort of a hobby. And I have to say, I really see improvement. I really genuinely do. In fact, I would cite a couple of examples which are playing out right now, but they're Canadian politics, and I know Americans don't follow Canadian politics. But that is in fact happening. We could cite all the websites, the fact checkers, and all the rest of it. And a lot of people, what I find interesting about this debate about, is it even worth it? We spend all this time fact checking, and then of course, if you're familiar with the psychological research, you know how biased, how people and intransigent people can be, right? In the face of contrary evidence. Will this actually change anything? And my answer is, well, that's human nature, and there has been some progress over the age of our species, and so you have to have at least a certain modicum of faith that actually, no, we can make incremental improvement. But I think it's more than incremental. I think with information technology, I think what's happened in particularly the last 5 years, is pretty remarkable. I think there are fewer stories about, the effects of the communication strategy, what this means for the Clinton campaign or whatever. I think there's less of that happening going on. And when a politician really tells a whopper, something that's very clearly not true, 2 + 2 = 5, they really do suffer for it, and they get chased for it in a way that they haven't in the past.
There's a whole side of the political spectrum that's rewarding that kind of behavior.
Yeah.
Right, so
you could never stand up and say Robinson Cano is only batting .220 right now.
Yeah.
And everyone can see that's not true. And yet people can stand up and say that climate change isn't happening, even though 2 papers out of 13,000 published in the last 2 years say that it is.
Yeah.
So
how do we reconcile that?
I guess, so I can say that part of it, at least, so here, now that I sit in a J school, part of what we're trying to do is help the journalists get the skills to be able to call bullshit, to do that, right, confidently. But I think, and the only reason I think that I was able to make this case to the dean or to my colleagues when I've had to propose courses is that I don't think that this is purely a reflex of journalism. I think this is something that we have to deal with at a K through 12 level, that the teaching of statistics, for better for worse at the moment, is a bit like a math class, and it is very far away from being able to deal with real world problems like this. And in fact, I think that there's interesting opportunities to hybridize something like journalistic education along with sort of data training at the K through 12 level, so that you have sufficient scaffolding that the students can learn about climate change, can learn about obesity, can learn about bullying in the schools, can talk about all of these things that they can't talk about in current probability and statistics classes because they're taught by algebra teachers. Not that there's anything wrong with an algebra teacher, but there's not scaffolding in a math class to talk about socially relevant issues. There needs to be a place where you can talk about socially relevant issues in the context of data and how decision making is made and how case making is made. And I think that there's an interesting hybrid with journalism and sort of data technology that's possible at a K through 12 level that could really change things, because this is not just about journalism. The stakes really are about sort of our citizens more broadly.
Thank you. And on that note, I'm afraid we have to wrap up this panel. I'd like to thank all our panelists again for a very lively conversation.